Hi everyone and welcome to our fifth Python tutorial. Your host is Morex Decoder. So yeah, let's head over to discuss what we'll be covering in this video. So in this video we're gonna cover functions, and then we'll cover a little bit of lists. So with this one, we won't actually have them on the slides. We're gonna apply that when we on the coding application, simply because we don't want to be throwing too much concepts at the same time. So in terms of the types or the data types, right, you do have a data type that is of a list, and the special thing about this one is that it can hold multiple values. Previously we've been dealing with just a variable that is capable of holding only one value. The special part about this one, or what makes this one different from the previous variables, is that this one can hold multiple variables of all the types that we have in it we discussed about. So you can have an integer, you can have a string, you can have a char within this one variable, and I will show you how it all works. Cool. So the first thing that you will have, or the first question you will ask yourself, is what is a function? So a function, this is a block of code which only runs upon being called. So when you define a function, you define a function based on the application that you want to design. And that function is going to do a specific job, and then it will only run when you need it. And the good thing about this one is that you don't have to recode the same action that can be done with this function. You just call the function. That is why the definition says which only runs upon being called. This function only runs when it is called, and you can call it as many times as you want, which means that you can use a certain code that you defined, a certain block of code that you define multiple times. Let's look at the syntax, right? So you start with the def, that's the keyword, right? And then name, this is the name of your function, and then you're gonna have open and close parentheses. Just like a conditional statement, you're gonna have colon, which is gonna be the one that distinguish between statements that are within your function or outside the function. So these are the statements, and we'll see is indented. If you remember from our previous discussion, indentation is going to be the spaces that are there starting from how your function starts, right? So when you indent, or when you have this block, your statements need to be indented. It can be just one space, or a tab, which is 4 spaces, which is the mostly used format, right? Let's discuss something else as well, right? So whenever I define a function, it always returns a value, right, of a specific data type. If you define a function that doesn't return something explicitly, so if you don't specify that you want this function to return a certain type, there is a type that is always being returned, which is a non type. So I know this is not easy to understand, but think of it like this, right? If you have an object, right, you have an object, right? If that object, or if you have a variable that is not defined, if you don't provide a value for that object, right, there's a value that will be provided by default, which is a null, right? But then in this case, in a function will always return a null. That's the value that gets returned when a function doesn't return anything. If you've done C or Java, you will know of this kind of function, or this type of function. It's a void function. It returns nothing, right? or you can return the value of any data types, right? From our first tutorial, we discussed of different data types, and we are adding on the types in this video. As I've mentioned, that we'll be adding lists, which we'll see and explore during the application part, right, of the video. And so you can define a function and return maybe an integer, return maybe a string. It depends on you. You can return anything, to be specific, right? So one might be asking, what if I return the input function? Will that still work? Definitely. If you remember from our previous discussion of the input function, I think it was still the very first video where we discussed displaying information, then that led us to getting the input from the user, right? That input is a function. It returns what data type? As I've mentioned, it returns a string. If you want to get a user input of an integer, you explicitly convert that string to an int, right? Cool. So let's discuss a bit of types of functions, right? So this is more or less more of a variance of a function, to be specific. So you have a function that is no parameters. If you check the definition or the syntax of our function, you saw just empty parameters, like empty parentheses, right? There was nothing inside. That's a function without parameters. And then you have a function with parameters. Now these parameters can be of any data type, which we have discussed in the very first video. Now you see how the whole thing is building up, right? You started with just those data types, just printing them out as it is, but now we are applying them with a new concept of function, right? Cool. So I think in terms of the theory, we should stop here. We don't have to do much of the theory, because if you've noticed, we just do a little bit of explanation of a concept so that you get an idea of what the concept is all about. But then whether you fully master the concepts or not, that depends on you and what you do afterwards, after getting more information about a certain concept. Do you just limit yourself with just what you've been taught, or you use the tools that you are given, and also learn by yourself? As I mentioned, we will be continuing to use our new tool, okay, my favorite tool, which is just Vim. And I did mention that you guys can use any tool of your choosing, right? Let's just zoom in a bit. That should be fine. So I'm just gonna create a directory, make directory. Let's just name it functions. Change directory, functions. Cool. And then it's Vim. Let's just create a Python script called function.py. Cool. And then we start. So before we discussed what these are, right? This is just a doc string. So what we're gonna do is define a function with no parameters. No parameter. With no parameters, right? And it will just display something, right? We're not giving a full definition. And then we're going to define a function, define a function with parameters. And then we're gonna define a function that creates a list of numbers. But before we do that, I think we should let's just use a single thing. Define a list and assign values to a list, right? We're just gonna start with that. Then we'll create a function. We'll advance our knowledge and create a function so that creates a list of numbers. And what we'll combine this with is we'll make use of our loops, which is the discussion we had I think on tutorial 3. Yeah, that's when we had a discussion about loops, because the previous tutorial was all about strings and string manipulation and the methods. And I do hope you guys did go and learn other methods that exist there in terms of strings, because there's a whole bunch of methods that you can apply to a string, right? Cool. So let's start off with the function that has no parameters, right? The way you define this function is the keyword def, right? You use def and then you have a function name. Let's just say display. It display, right? And then you have opening and closing parentheses, then you have a colon, then enter, right? By default, when you enter, it's already indented for you. You don't have to indent. You can still indent if you want, but it's better to just use the default indentation, right? This is just to tell the Python interpreter that when you interpret this function, this is a block of code that is falling inside this function. And then what I can do there is just say print I am a function. I am a parameterless function. Cool. Now here's the thing, right? If we try to attempt to run this code, what's gonna happen? So far the code that we have is this. These are just something that the compiler ignores, so it doesn't even bother interpret that because it just ignores them. It doesn't have anything to do with it, doesn't have any use to do with them, right? So cool. Let's create a new tab of ours and then we run our program python 3 and then its functions, right? If I run this, it just runs, it doesn't print anything. Now if you go back here, you will notice, or you will recall from our definition, that this function only runs according to the definition of a function only runs upon being called. Without calling it, it won't run. So last week, the last tutorial, we discussed of this condition: if name and then it's main, right? So this is just you defining the main method, or you defining where to start. So the reason we introduced this is because this was our way of being led to the discussion of functions, because you just cannot call the functions, right? And you want to have a systematic way of calling your functions. So this can be used as more of your main, because when your Python interpreter interprets this, it will start there. Yes, it is aware of the function that are there, right? But then it's gonna start there and then it's gonna call a function, then it's gonna go to that function and do whatever that function is, and once it's done, it comes back to the next line, right? So in this case, we're just gonna call display and then open parentheses and close parentheses, and that's it, right? If we are to run this now, you see it prints, right? I'm a parameterless function. I can call this function again. Let's call it again, display, and then I come here and call this function, right? You see that I call the function again. So this function is only doing one job. It is only printing text. So you can define a function that does a specific function or a specific action as many times as you want. If you recall from a simple calculator we created, you can create a function that adds, a function that divides. Instead of us just using conditional statements, we can just use a function, and then that way we can properly create a calculator. Whenever we want to add, we know the function to call to add, because when it comes to a condition only runs once and that's it, right? Unless if you're using a loop. But then if you're using a loop as well, it's better to just have function, then that way you have a main program that makes use, or the main function that makes use of other functions, or other function that does specific action, right? That's what we have. Cool. So now let's go back to our functions. We're done with the first discussion, right? So now let's do this one. So it's def, and then function name, let's just say number, open and close parenthesis, and then we're gonna have num, right? So what this function is gonna do is just gonna print I am number, and then it prints. So this is gonna be num is gonna be an integer, right? And then we're gonna add that to a string, so we have to convert that to a string, right? And then we have that, right? That's what it does. So when we say parameters, this is called a parameter, and the parameter is a parameter of a function. So when you define a function and you want to have parameters, you can add that there. If you remember when we did print, we can do print, put the first value, comma, second value, comma, third value. Just as with this one, we have the first parameter, right? We can add comma, then the second parameter, comma, the third parameter, then comma, and so on and so on. Now, do you get what this is going? This is going. You can have as many parameters as you want, right? If a function only takes one parameter, you only have to provide one argument. Now you might be thinking, what is an argument? So let's go to the function call, right? So we have display, that is fine. Let's just print a line, 2 lines actually. So we use escape character, and then that. So now we want to call the function number, right? And then we've open parenthesis and close parenthesis. Since our function has a parameter, we have to provide or call the function with an argument. Now, an argument is the value that you pass when you call a function. A parameter is the value that you pass, or is the value that you define your function with, right? It has one parameter. When you call a function, you provide an argument. Now that's the difference between a parameter and an argument. Argument when you're calling a function, parameter when you're defining a function, right? Cool. So what we want to do there is to provide maybe 50, right? Cool. As I mentioned, you can call this function that does the same method multiple times. So now I will say number, and then I will say 90, right? So which means that I'm using this to just print my value, and then you will see that it's printing any value, right? It doesn't matter what value I provide, it prints that with the same text, right? If I was to run this program, you will see I am number 50, I am number 90. That's what your function is doing. So you will see that these function or these functions simplifies your life in such a way that instead of having a print that says I am what each and every time, I just do that once. So if I wanted to count from 1 to 10 and I wanted to print a little bit of a message at the beginning before the number, I could just use that function, call it as many times as you want, and it makes your code simple and easy to follow, right? Cool. So that's a function with a parameter, right? Now let's quickly discuss this new variable, and then we're gonna apply that with a bit of a function that creates a list of numbers, and then you will see something that I want to demonstrate as well. If you remember from our slides, we mentioned that a function can return a value or cannot return a value, and then I'll also show you something just now, or actually we can start with that now. So this is a function, right? If you want to see what function returns or what value the function returns, you can just use print, and then you do this, right? So you're printing the value that the function returns. If I do this, you will see that it prints that, and then this is me printing the value that it returns none value, right? That's that default that I'm talking about. If you create a function that returns a certain data type, it will return the value of that data type you define the function with. Cool. So now let's discuss a list, right? So same thing. When you define a list, you have a variable name, right? That variable name can be name, right? And then you assign a value, right? You remember with a string is double quote. Char, same thing as single quote or double quotes, because there is no specific data type. There's no an explicit data type for char when it comes to Python. You can just use a string and then provide just that one char, right? When you define a list, you have a square bracket and an open bracket, right? A square and a close, an open square bracket and a close square bracket, and then inside are the items or the values. So for instance, I can say Morex, I can provide a different data type 50, I can provide even that, I can provide even a char, right? Cool. Now let's display these values, right? Print name. Cool. If you run this, what happens? It prints that, and that's printed first. Now your question might be, why did it start printing that first? Now your interpreter, it goes through your code from there to there, right? Since this is not inside a function, is executed because the interpreter interprets and executes at the same time, right? So if you wanted this to be in order, you could just define that in a function and then print the list, right? But one thing I want to discuss now is adding something we discussed before, which is a for loop, right? So you have a for loop, and then you have an item, right? This is the item in your list. Remember before we used to just say in range, right? And then we said that a for loop is a loop that iterates through a sequence, right? In this case, we are iterating through a sequence, but our sequence is a list. And then we can just print each of those items by just saying this, right? And then if you execute our code, you will see that it prints each and every item. Rex 50, true, then A, and then it does the functions, right? I hope that makes sense. Cool. So now let's just create one last program and then we close this tutorial. Let me remove all this because we don't need that. Cool. So we're going to create a function that generates a number from 0, or let's just say counting from 1 to 20, right? So it's def generate num list, open and close parentheses. We're not gonna have any parameters in this case, or we can have a parameter and say n, right? Cool. For I in range. Cool. Remember we said our range has a start, end, and the steps, right? In this case, I'm just going to provide the start, which is 1, end at n, but then it always ends at 1 less than that, right? And then from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my list. So I have my num, which is my list, and then it's empty, right? And then I have num. Before we discuss just how to create a list with the items, what if you create a list with an empty item? How do you add items to your list? Now, if you were following the tutorial we just did about strings, you will learn that we have methods, or we had methods associated with strings. Just like with a list, just like with the string, a list can have methods as well. And then the method we're going to talk about here is the one that adds item to the list, which is called append. And then it takes a parameter, and then I just want to provide that, right? Cool. That's what I did, right? Then we're going to call the function. I think let's remove the previous function calls, and then we call a function called generate num list, right? Let me just copy this and paste. Cool. And then let's do something crazy, right? Remember, we have int, right? And then we're just gonna provide input. Say enter a number, right? And then we're done, right? So this seems a bit more complicated, but it's not. You could just simply create a variable, assign the value that gets to be returned when you have this, and then you do that. Or since you have an understanding that you are returning a value, which is the value that is going to be received from this function and gets processed accordingly, right? You just provide the value as it is there. Yes, it does make sense as to how can you provide a value that you're getting from the input, but as long as you understand that a function returns a value, you don't care about how the value is got, you care about getting the value, right? So you use that value accordingly to in your function. So if I run this program and then I say 50, right, it does that, right? But then now what if I want to print my values, right? So you can do this. Let's complicate this a bit, and this will leave you with something that is quiet. So for I in this, so meaning that we have to return what there, as I mentioned, we're gonna return, or it creates a list, right? Let's return that list, which is num. Cool. So you're returning a list which is num, and then you're processing that information. You see how complicated this is getting. And then we print I. And then if we run this and then we say 50, it generates numbers from 1 to 49. If you want to end at 50, you just add 1 there, but that's how you created them. So just to go through what we did, and you go through and practice this, is that we create a function that generates a number list, and then we are passing in a value. It doesn't matter what value we're passing in. We're passing in a value which is of an integer because you want to create a number, right? And then you create an empty list, and then use a for loop which runs n times, right? Then each and every time you get that number, right? So this is gonna start from 1, 2, 3 until n minus 1, right? And then you're gonna add those items. Once this is done, your list is no longer empty, so I returned the list, and then I get there. Cool. So I want to print items from a list. How do I do that? For I in, and then I need a sequence. So I have a function that is returning a sequence, so I call the function. Now the function requires a value as a parameter, so I pass in an argument, right, which returns a value. Now what did I pass there? it's an argument that gets returned whenever I use an input function, then convert that value to an integer because I want a number, and then I printed the value. So this is all the concepts that we have learned. So go practice these concepts and explore, and then you will be a master of functions, and you will be able to understand how these whole functions work. And that's it from me, guys, and I shall see you guys next week Monday. Do enjoy, and if you are new, do subscribe. If you did enjoy the video, do leave a comment, do leave a like, and yeah, we shall see each other next week.